So I want you to turn to the person sitting next to you, and I want you to tell them that you're a genius. Hold on. All right. How many people in this audience believe that their thoughts have something to do with their destiny? How many people believe that? So I got to know who I'm talking to here, right? Wow. That's really good. So now here's my next question. How come, as human beings, we keep creating the same circumstances in our life? The same job, the same relationships, the same conditions. How come nothing new happens in our life? I mean, if we accept that belief that our thoughts and our feelings produce our future, then the next question would be, what's happening in my life? Is there anything new happening? Now, quantum physics tells us that there are infinite potentials in the quantum field. In other words, there are innumerable experiences that are waiting as possibility for every single person. And that transcends culture and gender and race and political beliefs and intellectual ability. In other words, if you're alive and your heart is beating and you have a brain, you're creating reality, or you're creating your destiny based on how you're thinking and feeling. And nobody is excluded. Isn't that nice? So, how many people here saw the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? Did you like that movie? Yes. You know why you liked that movie? Because it was about you. It was about all of us. It spoke to your potential. It spoke to your possibility to change your mind. Quantum physics tells us, geniuses, that the environment is an extension of our mind. Now, if we change our mind, shouldn't something show up differently in our life? Come on, do you believe that?
Yes. Yes.
So if mind then is this process of thinking and feeling, then we have to say then that our habitual self that we've memorized as a personality, as an identity, is thinking the same thoughts every day and feeling the same feelings every single day. And yet we're expecting a different result in our life. Isn't that insanity? To do the same things and think the same way and expect something to change? So geniuses, think about this. If we know that the environment is an extension of our mind, and we really change our mind, the quantum field of potentials should give us some feedback in our life. And then our life becomes a scientific experiment where we get to see that the events and the opportunities that unfold are equal to the way we think or how well we've changed our mind. Now, how hard is it to change your mind? Now, I'm not talking about ordering chocolate ice cream instead of vanilla ice cream. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about fundamentally mind, body, and soul. Now, every time you have a thought, you make a chemical. And if you have great thoughts, or unlimited thoughts, or happy thoughts, you make chemicals that make you feel great, or feel unlimited, or feel happy. In other words, this immaterial thing called thought activates certain circuits in our brain that produce chemicals that signal the body so that we can begin to feel exactly the way we were just thinking. And if you have a negative thought or an unhappy thought or a self-depreciating thought, in a matter of seconds you begin to feel negative or unhappy or unworthy. That's how fast it works. So the thought then, our thinking, turns on chemistry in our brain and in our body that allows us to feel exactly the way we were just thinking. Now, the moment we begin to feel the way we're thinking, because the brain is in constant communication with the body, we begin to think the way we're feeling, which then makes more chemicals for us to think the way we feel, and then feel the way we think, and think the way we feel, and feel the way we think. And this process of thinking and feeling and thinking creates a state of being. Then we say, I am unhappy, because I thought unhappy thoughts and I felt unhappy. And then once I was feeling unhappy, I started to think more unhappy thoughts, which makes me feel more unhappy. And this process of thinking and feeling and thinking creates the state of being, listen closely, in which we memorize an emotional state that we call our identity. I'm guilty. I'm suffering. I'm unworthy. I am insecure. And as this process of thinking and feeling and thinking continues, if we can't think greater than how we feel, we'll never change. And if feelings become the means of thinking, and we can't think greater than how we feel, we're caught in an identity. To change, to truly change, is to think greater than how you feel. So, imagine now. Let's suppose you were thinking and feeling and thinking guilty thoughts that made you feel guilty. Just making it up. And the moment you begin to feel guilty, because you're feeling guilty, you begin to think guilty thoughts because you're feeling that way, which then makes more chemicals for you to feel and then think and feel. And you do that, say, for, I'm going to be conservative, 20 years. And that's because you inherited certain genetic patterns from your parents. Now, you know what you inherit from your parents? What they master emotionally. So if your mother was a master at suffering and guilt, because she was thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking, there's a good possibility one of the offspring are going to have those neurological circuits already patterned in place. Oh, no. But neuroscience and psychology tells us that's only 50% of who we are. That it's the environment, then, that we can shape and change our brains. That our genetics are the starting point in our life. But what if you're raised by the same people with the same emotional propensities? So we begin to think and feel because we're conditioned and we have the genetics in place to memorize the state of guilt and suffering. Have I lost anybody yet? No? Okay, so now let's pretend now you have this moment of enlightenment. And you say, today, I stop. Now, I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to blame. I'm not going to make excuses. And if you're Italian, I'm not going to have self-pity. I'm not going to feel bad. I'm going to stop. Basta. That's right. So now, you're no longer going to think the same thoughts that are going to make the same feelings. Right? You're going to say, I stop. So, 2 hours goes by, and you feel really good about yourself. But now the body, who's been conditioned over time to that cycle of chemistry for 20 years, the body, the cells of the body, have modified the receptor sites to make more room for the chemicals of guilt. And the cells of the body, they go like this. What is she doing up there? We have changed our receptor sites. We've modified our chemistry. This continuity is pretty reliable. And all of a sudden, she's going to stop today. We can't have that. So all the cells of the body, they get together. And they say, let's send a message to the brain. So now they send a message up the spinal cord, right up to the circuits of the brain. I call that the fast track. Straight up. Now, at the same time, the chemistry of the body, the chemistry of guilt has lowered. Because you're not thinking and feeling the same way. So, values have lowered. And the thermostat in the brain, called the hypothalamus, says values are going down. We got to make more. So it starts to signal the thinking brain to start to think in its habitual ways. And then the next thing you know, you start to hear these thoughts in your head, the chatter. And it starts to say things like, you can start tomorrow. Tomorrow's a better day. Not today. Or how about this one? Any other time but this time. This is a good reason to suffer. And of course, my favorite is, this doesn't feel right. And the moment we believe in that thought, the moment we listen to those sub-vocalizations in our brain, we immerse ourselves back into that automatic program and we return back to the normal self. Now, psychology tells us that 90% of who we are subconscious programs that we've memorized. 10% of our conscious mind is fighting against 90% of our subconscious automatic programs. So the person may consciously want to be happy. They may consciously want to be healthy. They might consciously want to be free. But the 20 years of guilt and suffering, the redundancy of those chemicals has conditioned the body to be the mind. And when the body becomes the mind, that's called a habit. A habit is when the body's become the mind. So the change then is to pull the mind out of the body and put it back in the brain. So, think about this. How many people here could, at some point in their life, couldn't consciously remember a phone number? And then they pick up the phone, they look down at the number, the keypad, and they go like this. And they dial the number. I mean, what's up with that? In other words, your conscious thinking brain couldn't remember it. But you practiced it so many times that your body knew better than your brain. Now, that is where our emotional reactions exist. That's where our personality and our behaviors stem from. Memorized automatic programs. And psychology tells us by the time we're 35 years old, the identity, the you and the me, the personality is completely formulated. Which means we have memorized a set of behaviors, a set of attitudes, a set of beliefs, a set of perceptions that are unconsciously programmed within us. So the person may consciously want to be happy, but their body has been conditioned to be the mind, and it's conditioned to be unhappy. So the mind and the body are in opposition. And when mind and body are in opposition, and the body has been conditioned to be the mind, the servant, which is the body, has become the master. And the master has gone off to sleep for 20 years. And now the master wants to get back on the throne. What's the servant going to say? Where you been? You don't know any of this stuff. So mind and body in opposition is the biggest reason people can't change. And when the conscious mind is going against 90% of that subconscious automatic state of mind, and when that program runs, when the automatic program begins, it's so memorized that it only takes a stimulus from the environment, from a person or a thing, or a stray thought in our own mind, and it cranks the program, it starts the program, and we go unconscious. So how awake are we during our normal day? So then, how do we change? I mean, how do we begin to make conscious what was unconscious? Because when that automatic program runs, it's like when your computer, how many people here, when your computer all of a sudden starts doing crazy things, the programs, and you start going, the windows start coming up and the program's gone out of control? Yeah, all the time. So the conscious mind trying to change that automatic program would be like you yelling at the computer, hey, stop, stop. The computer's going to keep doing what it does. It doesn't change. So we have to learn how to get into the program, into the operating systems, and begin to unlearn that state of mind and relearn a new state of mind. So then you can begin to see why our prayers aren't answered. If a person prays with intention to be free with their mind, but their body has been conditioned to guilt, mind and body, their whole being is not in the prayer. So when we said, rejoice in your prayers, it means then that you have to condition the body with a new mind. And when mind and body are working together, the heart is open. When mind and body are working together, the power of the universe is moving through us. And so then, you know, I'm so happy to see so many men in the audience. Because when I lecture, most of the time it's women. But you know, Latinos, they have a great balance between their head and their hearts. They really do. And men's brains work very differently than women's brains. Women? Men? Yes? Now, I love to study functional brain scans. I love them. And if you look at a functional brain scan, is a motion picture of the brain. And when we can see the brain in action, or we can see the brain at work, that's called mind. Mind is what the brain does. And with functional scans, we can see how the brain and mind are working. Now, ladies, if you look at a functional brain scan of a man resolving a problem, very single-minded, very same pattern. And if you say to the man, I'll give you a little hint to help you solve the problem. If you give them the hint, the scan doesn't change. You know, like when your husband's driving along and you're lost, and you say the map says this, and he doesn't listen, he goes the way he thinks he should go. That's because men are very single-minded. Single-minded. single-minded, intentional, clear, single-minded. That's why when they go Christmas shopping, they go out and they buy one present. They come home. They cross the name off the list. They wrap the present, put it under the tree, go back out the same day, hunt again, buy the second present, come home, cross the name off, wrap the next present. Very linear, very methodical. Most of the men are very serious right now. That's the male brain. Now, men's brains are wired for intention, for activity, for single-mindedness. Now, if you look at a functional brain scan of a woman resolving a problem, oh my God. Gentlemen, it's like a lightning storm going on in there. You know how women can change their mind 10 times in 1 second? I was in a relationship with a woman one time, and when she started talking to me, I'd say, wait, tell me what you're going to say last first. Because I don't have a lot of time. Oh, I'm having fun now. So, women's brains genetically, gentlemen, men were hunters. Go out, provide, come back, protect. Simple, basic rules. Awareness in terms of protection and survival. Women's brains, because they took care of the young, because they took care of the whole, everybody. When they made decisions, they considered everybody. The youngest child to the oldest woman, and everybody in between. They considered the whole. They considered the community. And so their brains work in a very holistic fashion. They're considering all possibilities at the same time. And because they consider the whole, or they consider the community, that's why, gentlemen, they communicate so well. Yes? And women come to conclusions differently than men without going through the methodical process. They trust their feelings. They trust their intuition. They're in touch with their emotions. They can surrender. Listen to this. They can surrender and trust an outcome without logically going through the steps that the man does. And any wise man, by the time he's 45, doesn't take counsel with a woman who's older and wiser is missing a great opportunity. So now listen, think about this. Women's brains are wired for the whole, for trusting an outcome, for the intuitive process, to surrender to a concept. So that's why when they go Christmas shopping, they go to the stores and the men are walking behind them and they say, oh my God, let's get 2 of these. And let's get 3 of those. And let's buy those for next Christmas. And let's get that for our trip to Venezuela. And the man says, I'm going to go watch the soccer game. Come and find me. So now think about this. What are the 2 ingredients? By the way, there's a reason I'm telling you this. What are the 2 ingredients for creation? Thought and feelings. What are the 2 ingredients for creation? Intention and surrender. So men's brains are the reason I use so much science in my lectures, is to get men to trust in an outcome they can't perceive with their senses. To surrender to the quantum field. Even though you can't see it or smell it or taste it or feel it or hear it. Can you believe in it even though it hasn't happened yet? So we have to provide the science for men to say, I got it. I understand. I can do it. So we have to teach men how to surrender. And women, of course, we have to teach them how to become clear, single-minded, to think about themselves instead of thinking about everybody else, and get clear in what they want. And you know that any man who is clear in what he wants and who is in touch with his emotions is a very attractive man. And a woman who is very single-minded and trusts in an outcome is a charismatic being. So it takes two ingredients. And the reason we know that, because there was an experiment done a ways back where they took DNA, you know DNA? And they put DNA into a vial. Now, this is for the men. And they said, we want you to intentionally, in your mind, these were with a group of skilled people who could pray. And by the way, prayer is a skill. They said, we want you to intend on this DNA unwinding. Focus and intend on it, just unwinding. And at the end of the time frame, when they checked the DNA, guess what happened? Nothing. Then they took a group of people and they said, listen, we want you to move into an elevated state of joy and emanate goodwill and inspiration. Just do that around the DNA. And guess what happened to the DNA? Nothing. Nada. But when they said, now, we want you to intentionally focus on that DNA. We want you to move into this elevated state as if it already unwound. And feel how you would feel in that state of heartfelt emotion, of joy. And when they combined those two ingredients, thinking and feeling, 25% change in the DNA. So what are you thinking and what are you feeling every single day? Because your thoughts are the electrical field that you produce. That's intention. And how you feel is the magnetic field that you produce. And so our thinking and feeling produce an electromagnetic field around us that affects every single atom in your life. How many people believe that may be possible? Gentlemen, I'm not done yet. You got to see it to believe it. You got to believe it to see it. Now, I'm teasing him, but you know what? Our repetitive thinking and feeling, our repetitive behaviors, the concept in neuroscience. Are you guys still geniuses? Come on. Still geniuses? The concept in neuroscience says nerve cells that fire together wire together. So your repetitive thoughts and your repetitive actions, your behaviors and your intentions force neurons to fire and develop long-term relationships. So if you're thinking the same thoughts and performing the same actions every single day, could you understand how the brain would become hardwired into a certain pattern? 20 years of thinking and feeling and behaving the same way, the neurons become very finite set of circuits. When someone says you're thinking in the box, you're not thinking any other way but the way you typically think. So then to think outside the box is to force the brain to fire in new sequences, in new patterns, and in new combinations. The concept in neuroscience is called neuroplasticity. And what is the main ingredient to make the brain begin to fire in new patterns, to begin to think outside the box? The main ingredient is called knowledge. Learning. Every time you learn something new, you make a new connection in your brain. Learning is making new synaptic connections. Remembering is maintaining or sustaining those connections. So would you agree then as a genius that if you're making new connections, learning new things, wouldn't you agree that those new circuits you could use to make the brain fire in new ways? And do you think that you would perceive reality differently because of the new circuits you made? So I want to play a little game with you. Imagine I put up on the screen there a picture of a Monet painting. And I said, "Isn't that a beautiful painting?" And you would all say, yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And if I took that painting and I took it down off the screen, and I said to you, "You guys know anything about Monet? Do you know that he spent his whole life trying to see things differently?" He was fascinated with light. He loved the light first thing in the morning, and he loved the light at sunset. And he tried to capture that light in his paintings so that when people saw his paintings, they would begin to look for it in nature and appreciate nature. And he was known to say things like, "The bridge and the wisteria are one and the same." And as a child, his family owned a textile mill. And he would sit and watch the two fabrics come together. And he would trance on how they would form a pattern. And he wanted to paint that way. And as he got older, he developed cataracts in his eyes. Thick protein coating over the lens. And when he looked at the light, the cataract diffused the light. So he started to paint exactly what he was seeing in those impressionistic patterns. And when he was in his elder years, the doctor said, "Listen, you have cataracts. We can take those cataracts out." And he said, "Are you crazy? I spent 45 years of my life trying to see this way." Now, if I put that painting back up on the screen, would you see it differently? Come on. What's changed? Your mind changed. You made new connections, and because you made new connections, your brain is firing in new patterns, new sequences, and new combinations, and you're perceiving what always existed, but your brain wasn't wired to perceive it. Now, do you think you perceive reality based on how your brain is wired? What's the difference between the wine connoisseur and the person who drinks wine out of a box. The wine connoisseur had learned about wine. He experienced and paid attention to the flavors. He looked for the tannins and the oak. She smelled the aroma. And every time they associated that smell with that taste, with that wine, they were enhancing the circuits and connections. And the person who drinks box of wine doesn't care about the taste. They want the high. And if you gave that Cabernet Sauvignon to the box of wine person, they don't have the circuitry to perceive reality the way the connoisseur does. Now, the person who lives in guilt and the person who lives in suffering, their circuits have fired and wired together to form a community of neurosynaptic connections, just like the wine connoisseur, more intricate circuits. In other words, their brain is a reflection of their mind. So would you agree then that the person who reads Braille, who's blind, and their two fingers is where their mind is? And they've fired and wired the same set of circuits in these two fingers mapped in this part of their brain over and over again, so well that more of that real estate in that part of the brain is for those two fingers. And if you did an autopsy of the Braille reader's brain that's correlated with these two fingers, more enriched connections. Because as we fire those circuits over and over again, over and over again, over and over again, there comes a moment where this chemical is released that causes neurons to develop a long-term relationship and sprout new intricate connections, more densely packed jungle of neurons. So then the brain is the reflection of the person's attention, intention, repetition, and learning, and instruction. So if the person is insisting on guilt, thinking the same thoughts and performing the same actions, would they have a more densely set of neurological circuits that's related to how they're thinking and feeling? So then here's my next question. If you accept that you perceive reality based on how your brain is wired, do you think you perceive reality based on how you're emotionally feeling? You do? You know, they did an experiment where they took a group of people, clinically depressed. And by the way, depression is so high in the United States right now. But you take a group of depressed people and you show them equal pictures of a wedding scene and a funeral scene. And then you call them into the lab a couple hours later and you say, which slides were there more of? Wedding or funeral? They all say, oh my God. There are way more funeral scenes. If you show those same slides, equal slides, to people that are well-adjusted and happy, and call them into the lab an hour later, they see more wedding scenes. So we perceive reality based on how our brain is wired and how we emotionally feel. So we're back to thinking and feeling again. Now, how many people here know someone who, now, I'm taking a chance, who has mastered suffering? Come on, I had an Italian grandmother. I know this one really well. Listen, when my Italian grandmother said the rosaries, I thought there was a war coming or something. It was a very intense moment. I thought she was having a heart attack or a seizure or something. She was praying and suffering at the same time. And I don't know where I'm going. By the way, I grew up thinking Jesus Christ was Italian until I was in 4th grade. She was talking Italian to him. He looked Italian in all the pictures. So you know someone who's mastered suffering, right? And my definition of mastery is when our internal chemical state is greater than anything in our external world. We've memorized the emotional chemical state, and nothing can change us. So you know someone who's mastered suffering, right? How do we know that? Because you say to them, hey, did you read that book that I gave you? No. Did you watch that DVD? No. Hey, listen, we're going to go out to dinner. We're going to do dancing. We're going to go see some comedy. We're going to walk down the road and have some ice cream, and then we're going to meet up with some friends. You want to come? No. I've memorized this emotional state, and nothing in my environment, no person, no event, no experience, no condition, no thing is going to move me from this internal chemical state. That's mastery. Now, we have 3 brain systems in one. 3 brains that allow us to go from thinking to doing to being. And because we have these 3 brain systems, that person moved into a state of being so well that it is now an automatic subconscious state of mind. And that internal chemistry is so memorized that nothing can move them from it. And because we have 3 brain systems in place that allow us to go from thinking to doing to being, we can master an internal chemical state of joy. And we can insist on joy just as well as the person who suffers insists on guilt. And we can memorize that internal chemical state so well that nothing from our external environment can move us from it. Because the first brain that we have is the thinking brain. You're listening to me right now with your thinking brain. And as you pay attention, and as you begin to think in different ways, you're reinforcing circuits. You're learning philosophy and information. But that's not enough. We have to apply what we learn. We have to personalize it. We have to demonstrate it. We have to teach the body what the mind has intellectually understood. And when we get the body involved, when we modify our behavior, and we have a new experience, that new experience produces a new emotion. Because the end product of every experience is called an emotion. And feelings and emotions help us to remember experiences better. They tag the experience as important. You remember catching that fish off the coast of Cancun? You remember that surprise Christmas present? You remember your first kiss? All right, maybe your first You remember where you were on 9/11? You remember these things because something from the environment, some stimulus from the environment, produced some internal chemical change. And this external thing that produces some internal chemical change, you pay attention to. You say, what is this that's producing this feeling? Oh, it's that person, or it's that event, or it's this thing. And the identification with that external thing, with this internal change, says that's a memory because it's an event in and of itself. So now, with the new experience, in the midst of the experience, everything we're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, all of our 5 senses are sending information back to the brain through 5 different pathways. And it's causing gangs of neurons to string into place and to release chemicals. And those chemicals signal the body so that you can remember the event. So now we're conditioning the body to learn what the mind has intellectually embraced. Now we have 2 brains working together. The emotional brain, the limbic brain. Now, to get people to go from thinking to doing is like herding cats. Because most people, they want to stay locked in that intellectual realm. So let's just say you read a book on compassion by the Dalai Lama. And now you decide that you got some knowledge and you're going to forgive your mother-in-law. So you forgive your mother-in-law, and you have this new experience, and you feel good. But you can't be asked to be canonized as a saint now. You can't have the experience once. You have to be able to repeat the experience over and over again, over and over again. You got to make it look natural and easy and second nature. And when we repeat it over and over again, we activate that 3rd brain, that subconscious brain, the cerebellum, that is in a state of being now. We've practiced it so many times, we don't have to think about it any longer. And when we're in a state of being, our internal chemistry has been memorized. And now we master forgiveness. We master compassion. And we don't have to think about it because we are it. So now, living in that state of being means the electromagnetic field that's around us is working in congruence with the mind and the body. The mind and body are working together. And now we're in the natural state of being, and it takes no effort. It's second nature. It's simple. It's easy. And if we can master that internal chemical state, just like the person who suffers, now we're talking about change. Is unlearning that emotional state. What is the emotional state that you've memorized, that you've decided that you are as a personality? That's not who you are. That's just some emotion that you think is who you are. So how does that happen? So you have an event in your life. Remember, experiences and events produce emotions. So you have an event in your life when you're 20 years old. And I don't know, I'm making this up. Your husband leaves you with 3 children. Okay? Now, that event produces some very strong emotions, right? And those emotions activate the primitive nervous system of survival, the fight-or-flight nervous system. And those chemicals of survival have us act in very predictable ways, bring up the negative emotions of fear and anger and hatred. You ever notice that when you're angry, you're frustrated? When you're frustrated, you hate. When you hate, you judge. When you judge, you're jealous. When you're jealous, you're envious. When you're envious, you're insecure. When you're insecure, you're competitive. When you're competitive, you're self-centered. When you're self-centered, you're important. When you're important, you're arrogant. Same chemicals driving the brain for thoughts and behavior. But did you ever notice that when you're in love, you're happy? When you're happy, you're allowing. When you're allowing, you're unconditional. When you're unconditional, you're inspired. And when you're inspired, you've got great ideas, and you don't hold on to things any longer. New chemicals driving our thoughts and driving our behaviors. So geniuses. The event happens. You're abandoned now, and you emotionally feel that feeling. Now listen to this. What people don't know is that as they remember the event, 2 years later, every time they remember the event, they produce the same chemicals in the brain and the body as if the event was happening. So your memory of the event signals the body. Suffer. 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 Suffer again. Suffer, suffer, suffer. So the redundancy of that, it goes event, produces memory. The memory then has an emotion that attached to it, and that emotion is called a feeling. So then every time the person thinks of the event that produces the memory, it reproduces the feeling of suffering. And they do this for years. The thought, the memory, the suffering. A year goes by, forget the thought, just the memory and the suffering. The memory and the suffering. The memory and the suffering. Forget the memory. Let's just suffer. That's who I am. So who are you? You say, who are you? Oh, let me tell you who I am. I'm the person who's suffering because my husband left me with 3 kids when I was 20 years old. And I'm going to tell you all about it. And as I tell you all about it, I'm going to work myself up into this state so that I can reaffirm my identity. So then the person who can't change, the person who says, you see, I'm this way because my husband left me when I was 20. What they're really saying is, I can't overcome my attachment or my addiction to this emotion. I can't get it off me, and it's so part of me that I'm going to tell you why I can't change. It's because of this event. Is that it's not the event. It's the emotion. And when we overcome the emotion, and we have a healthy life, and a new marriage, and a great lover that we never knew we could have, and someone who's self-supportive, and has brilliant ideas, and is not needy. Oh my God, you think you care? You say, I'm so glad my husband left me. Because I got something great now. But the person who holds on never has the experience. Now, let's play a little bit, all right? Let's suppose, by the way, you're a great audience, I want to say that. So great, so great, so great. You know, the greatest gift you could ever give anybody, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest gift you could ever give anybody is your attention. How often do we give our attention to somebody, our true presence of mind? That's the greatest gift you can give anybody. So I'm honored, by the way, that you're paying attention so well. So, can we play a little bit more? Geniuses? Let's suppose now your husband, before he left you, was... We're going back. We're going back. Was abusive, was disrespectful, treated you less, but you had thoughts about that, you had experiences about it. He left you, and you reviewed, you thought about, oh, I should have said this to him, and I should, oh, in that time he did that, and you're thinking and feeling, and you're conditioning your body to be the mind of suffering. And you're neurologically wiring the circuits in place to memorize these hardwired circuits of suffering. The brain is reflecting how you're thinking and feeling and acting. Now let's just suppose we take your ex-husband, we put him in a straitjacket, we wrap him up, we put him in a cannon, he's going to be safe, don't worry. He'll be safe. And we shoot him to the moon. Now, Here's my question. He's gone. Would you agree that your brain is still wired for suffering? Would you agree that your body is still conditioned for suffering? Brain and body, or mind and body are in alignment. You're the master of suffering. So, would you agree that you perceive reality based on how your brain is wired? So, guess who you pick in the next relationship? Same guy, different haircut. And maybe age. Out of 1,000 people, you'll pick them out. Because your brain is looking for that to fulfill your emotional needs. You know how we know that? Did you ever meet someone for the first time? And you say, hi, how are you? What's your name? Sally. Hi, I'm Joe. And then you say, where are you from? Mexico. My wife is Mexican. Familiar person. Emotional connection. Ooh. Where do you live in Mexico, specifically? Oh, I had some friends that lived there. When did you live there?
All my life.
All your life. Well, I was there from 2002 to 2004. Do you know those people?
I don't.
You don't? Well, I know these people. You know, I went to a wedding, and were you at that wedding?
No, I wasn't. Yes, I was.
Yeah, you were. Oh, we have a familiar event. Emotional connection. You own those things? I own those things too. And you've had those experiences? I've had those experiences too. I like you. If emotions are the end product of experience, and we share the same experiences, wouldn't we share the same emotions? Come on, geniuses. We have an emotional connection if we know the same people, if we've done the same things, if we've been to the same places at the same time. Hey, and you've suffered as much as I've suffered. Hey, we got something in common. As long as you don't change, we're going to have a great relationship. Right? So, now let's just say, let's just say you have a person that you walk with every day and you complain about your life with. You know, you walk with your girlfriend and you complain about your boyfriends or your husbands. Or, you know, you have a friend that you golf with. Thank you. You have a friend that you golf with, and because you golf with this guy every day, you complain about business and the stock market and politics. And you have that emotional connection with them. Now, all of a sudden, you're going to change. And you're going to say, I'm not complaining anymore. I'm not blaming. I'm not making excuses. And I'm not feeling sorry for myself. And you're walking with your girlfriend, and she's going off, you know. And you're just walking, and she says, what is wrong with you today? Aren't you going to jump in with me? Or your friend, you know, you're golfing with, and you're playing great golf, and you're focused on the game, and he's complaining about all these things in his business, but you've decided not to complain anymore. You're going to say, hey, buddy, you okay? You're not going to suffer with me here? I like you better the other way. And so in the process of change, we break our connection with the external world. We break our connection with the environment. We break our connection to all the elements that reinforce the automatic programs to define us as an identity. Neuroscience and psychology tells us that the brain... Do you guys still geniuses? So I want to ask you a question. The brain is organized according to neuroscience, to reflect everything that you know in your life. Everything you know in the environment. A chair, a book, a person, place you live, place you're going to go, things you do, things you can demonstrate. The brain is organized to reflect everything we know in the environment. So if the brain is organized to reflect everything in the environment and our thoughts have something to do with our destiny, if the environment is causing us to think, if we're responding to the environment every single day by recognizing familiar people and familiar emotions and familiar places, wouldn't you agree then, if the environment is causing us to think, what are we creating more of the same? We're reinforcing the same circumstances in our life. In other words, as the environment causes us to think, we're only thinking equal to the environment, which causes the same things to unfold. To change is to think greater than the environment, to think greater than the circumstances in our life, to think greater than the conditions in our world. And by the way, geniuses, that's what we admire in history, the great people in history. Whether it was William Wallace, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, charismatic leaders, Queen Elizabeth, they all said the same thing. They all said, you see, I have this dream. I have this vision. I have this idea. I can't get it out of my head. And, you know, even though this dream hasn't manifested yet, I can't see it yet. I can't smell it or taste it or feel it or hear it. I don't have the experience of it yet. But I'm going to live as if it's already happened. I'm going to live as if it's happening now. And I don't care what happens to my body. I don't care what happens, what the conditions are in my life. And I don't care how long it takes. I'm just going to live as if it's already done. Now that leader is a true leader. Do you know why? Because he has mind and body working together. She has behavior matching her intention. She has thoughts and actions aligned. Mind and body are working together. A true leader has mind and body working together. A politician has his mind doing one thing and his body doing something else. So, can you believe in a thought, a dream, a vision, that you can't perceive with your senses, but you've thought about enough times in your mind that your brain is reflecting the event ahead of the experience? If you can live by that law, you're living by the quantum law. We can prepare the brain, the mind, and the body ahead of the actual experience. And if the brain, the mind, and the body are ahead of the actual experience, in the quantum field, the experience happened. Because the body and the mind are reflecting it already. So how does subjective mind affect the objective world? In other words, geniuses, does your environment control your thinking, or does your thinking control your environment? So if the brain and the mind and the body are ahead of the actual experience, and it looks like in the brain that the event happened, it looks like in the body's already changing as if the experience happened, wouldn't you agree then in the quantum field the event has happened? And now the event finds you. The quantum field rearranges your life. And it comes in a way you can't predict. And it's fun. And it's surprising. And it leaves no doubt that it came from this greater mind. Because if you can figure out how it's going to happen, it's not new. And the brain wouldn't change. It has to be a surprise, and the brain loves surprises. And so the brain is no longer a record of the past. But if the brain and the mind and the body are ahead of the experience, now the brain is a map to the future. And the privilege of being a human being is that we can make thought more real than anything else. And because we can make thought more real than anything else, the thought can become the experience. And all it takes is training the brain and the mind. And when we get truly serious and we make up our mind, you know, when you make up your mind about something, how many people have said, that is it, I am done? You know, that's the first time your body says, oh my God, he's actually serious today. Instead of, I think I'm going to get happy, you know, I think I'll start tomorrow. But why do we wait as human beings for crisis to happen for us to get serious? Why do we wait for tragedy before we make up our mind? Before we say, that's it? Great leaders in history never waited. They were possessed. You know, why do we talk ourselves out of greatness? We talk ourselves out of greatness because, you know, just because you have a thought doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And the moment that we realize that we can observe our thoughts and observe our actions without participating in them, we're on the first step to change. Because the privilege of being a human being says, because we have this big frontal lobe of ours, 40% of our entire brain, we have this faculty called metacognition that says we can observe our thoughts and observe our behaviors so that we can change our thoughts and change our behaviors so that we can produce a better outcome in our life. So that we can forecast an idea into the future. We can modify our behavior to do a better job. So the people in history that were great, they didn't wait for evidence. Their brain and their mind and their body were ahead of the event. And, you know, when we live with that type of idealism, we are believing in thought more than we're believing in the conditions in our world. Now, what is your definition of prayer? Isn't prayer believing in thought more than you believe in the environment? Aren't you believing in your intention more than you're believing in your circumstances? And because we all share the same brain anatomically, what do we do when we get in trouble in our lives? We all do the same thing. We eliminate the environment. We want to think without the environment. We want to close our eyes and say, this is what I want. I want this. And I'm going to intend on this. I need a change in my life. And I'm going to keep intending on this until some supernatural power comes in and reorganizes my life to reflect my intention. So prayer is a skill. And the skill is that we practice it and move into an elevated state of mind so that mind and body can work together. So, but we can't just do that like, you know, if we just talk about this without doing it, I call it dinner conversation. You know, good dinner conversation. Nobody's really changed. You argued concepts, and everybody's going to go back to doing what they do. So we wait for crisis to show up Because crisis means you don't want to keep your social agreements anymore. You don't want to, you can't go on as business as usual because you're hurting or there's pain. And you got to get serious now because it's your health or your family or your life or your job. But we usually wait for crisis before we act. But if I told you that the body is a protein-producing machine, that skin cells make skin proteins, it's called collagen and elastin, and muscle cells make muscle proteins, it's called actin and myosin, and your stomach cells make stomach proteins, they're called enzymes. So the body's a protein-producing machine. Genes are expressed when they make proteins. Now, what turns on the gene are the chemicals from the brain that push the receptor sites that turn on the gene to make a protein. So if we keep thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking and making the same chemicals that activate the same receptor sites that turn on the same genes, we're going to start to wear those genes out. And you're going to start making cheaper proteins. And as we start making cheaper proteins, you're going to start to age. What is aging? All aging is improper protein production. What happens to your skin when you age? It wrinkles. Less collagen. What happens to your bones? They become brittle. Less collagen. What happens to your muscles? They atrophy. Less actin and myosin. So it's the redundancy of the same chemicals that activate the same genes that cause the body to move to its genetic destiny. So if we're not learning anything new, and we're not having any new experiences, now I'm not talking about eating Ethiopian food, or getting a new haircut. I'm not talking about new hairstyle. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about having your thoughts create your destiny. An unknown experience. If we're not having those events in our life, we're left with the genetic circuits that we've inherited from our parents. Which means we're going to think the same thoughts as our parents, behave the same way as our parents, and feel the same feelings that our parents felt. But neuroscience says that the brain is not hardwired, not as hardwired as we once thought. That learning and experiencing upscale the hardware of the brain. And that genes are as plastic and as changeable as your brain. But genes are like on-off switches. They're like lights. Certain lights are turned on and other lights are turned off. And the redundancy of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking keeps signaling the same cell to keep certain lights on and the other lights off. But could we theoretically turn on new lights and turn off other lights? Is that possible? So, if you were to take the genes, the genes of one cell out of a skin cell, and you were to stretch it end to end, it would go 2 meters high. If you took all the genes out of your body and stretched them from end to end out of all the cells of your body and lined them up end to end, it would go to the sun and back 150 times. If you took all the genes out of the 6 billion people on the planet and you put them all together, it would fit in a grain of rice. And we express 1.5% of our genes. The other 98.5% is junk DNA. Out of that 98% that we express, we're 96% chimpanzee. 300 genes away from a chimp. 70% rat. But the genes are a library of potential. And we can turn on new genes and turn off old genes. You know how we know that? Because they're beginning to do experiments to say, we know that anger and pain and fear and anxiety and stress dysregulate genes to cause disease. 75 to 90% of every person that shows up at a doctor's office in the Western world shows up because of a stress-related disorder. And those chemicals of stress are what begin to break the body down. So they said, if these negative emotions make us sick, in other words, if our thoughts can make us sick, can our thoughts make us well? Good question, though, right? So they took a group of diabetics, type 2 diabetics, who are insulin dependent, developed diabetes later on in their life, turned on the genetic expression of diabetes. And they said, okay, one group is going to watch a boring, humorous lecture. We're going to feed them a very good meal, and then we're going to see what their blood sugar levels are. And their blood sugar levels went up about 123 points, which put them in the danger zone. So then they give them insulin. The insulin takes the sugar out of the bloodstream and deposits in the cells for energy. You guys still with me? Geniuses? Now they took another group of people and they had them watch a comedy show. For 1 hour they laughed. And they rated their laughter on a scale of 1 to 5. And this was a Japanese study. So for Japanese people to laugh, that's a big deal. I've been to Japan, I know. So it was a Japanese study. And now, after the comedy show, they measured their blood sugar levels. And those people who watched the comedy show, their blood sugar levels only rose about 70 points. Almost half of what the other people did. So then the scientists that did the experiment said, oh, well, you know, that's really simple. You start laughing, you contract your abdominal muscles, you contract your diaphragm, you're going to use up blood, sugar. But the geneticist that did the experiment, he tested the gene. Now check this out. They turned on some 23 genes in 1 hour just from laughing. 23 genes. They turned on new lights and they turned off old lights. In other words, the genetic expression of diabetes got turned off to some degree, and the genetic expression of health got turned on, regulating glucose, just from laughing. Now, did they say, oh, I got to think to my pancreas, you make insulin? Or did they just move into an elevated state of joy? Come on, which did they do? Why is it that when someone is subjected to stressful conditions in their life, that their hair turns gray overnight? Overnight. That's genes at work. So what genes are you turning on? What lights do you have on? And what lights do you have off? What have you memorized emotionally that you live by, that you think that is your identity? Because remember, we said thought, memory, feeling, thought, memory, feeling, memory, feeling, memory, feeling, feeling. This is who I am. Now, if we could remove that emotion that's driving your thinking, driving your behavior, and driving those other feelings, would you agree then you could unlearn that and make room to memorize a new emotional state? How many people think that's possible? Now, if you can get mind and body working together where you're not only thinking it, you're feeling it, and now you're thinking your intention is producing an electrical field, and your feeling is creating that magnetic field, and your electromagnetic field is joy, then wouldn't you agree then that something's got to show up unusual in your life? Because now you're living the prayer. You are it. You're being it. And the quantum field only responds to whoever we're being. Who we're being, what we've memorized. So a person can say, I'm thinking positive. I'm thinking thoughts that are positive, but how are they being? Negative. So mind and body are in opposition. They could pray all they want for a great outcome, but if they're feeling the opposite, it doesn't work. Why does the placebo work? Why can you give someone a sugar pill? Why can you give them a saline injection? Why is it that you can fake a surgery? And people over 2 years are still better. Do you know why? Because they automatically started to think that they were better. And then they started to act as if they were better. Then they started to feel better. And their thinking and acting and feeling allowed that infinite mind in us to give life to whoever we're being. Now that infinite mind is in every human being, independent of their culture or their race or their gender or their creed. And so, however we're being, however we're thinking and feeling and acting, if the placebo was given and you're acting as if you're better and thinking as if you're better, the thinking and acting is going to produce a state of being. Thinking, doing, being. And then that subconscious mind that's giving us life, that's keeping your heart beating and digesting your food and filtering your blood, that's organizing all the events, it responds to whoever we're being. And it loves us enough to give us life on our terms. That unconditional. So, you may say, well, Joe, that subconscious brain that's keeping my heart beating, you know, in actuality, that's the autonomic nervous system that does that. The automatic nervous system. So then I would say, okay, let's look at the autonomic nervous system. Where in the autonomic nervous system controls the way your heart beats and regulates your blood sugar levels and keeps genes on and genes off? Oh, you have to look in the brain. Okay, let's look in the brain. What part of the brain? Oh, it's in the limbic brain. Okay, let's look in the automatic limbic brain. Let's look in the organ. Where in the organ is it? Oh, it's in these tissues. Oh, those tissues control those things? Okay, let's look at those tissues. Oh, in those tissues, it's those cells that do it. Okay, let's look at the cells. Okay, what are the chemicals in the cells that are making that happen? Oh, it's those chemicals. But who's giving the instruction to those chemicals to do that if they're just inert materials? Oh, it's the molecules and the chemicals that do it. Let's look at the molecules. What are the molecules? Oh, those are atoms. It's the atoms that are doing it. Okay, well, let's look at the atoms. Well, 99% of the atom is nothing. It's invisible. It's energy. It's electromagnetism that's instructing the atoms, which instruct the molecules, which instruct the chemicals, which instruct the cells, which instruct the cell membrane, which instruct the tissues, which instruct the organ, which instructs the system, which instructs the body. And that immaterial aspect of us that has a mind that's so much greater than our mind gives us life on our terms. And so, have you developed a relationship with that intelligence? Have you taken time to interact with that mind every day? Just like you have a relationship with your husband or your girlfriend or your wife or your dog or your cat or your kids, even though it's invisible? Have you taken the time to give thanks for your life? Have you taken time to say, how can I do a better job today? I want to surrender my suffering to this mind. I need your help. Why do we wait for the end? Why not take care of the emotion that's going to lead to the physical manifestation later on in your life? Can you beat the health condition? And if you can get your mind and body working together and get that old mind out of the body and put a new mind in and maintain that modified state of being, your life should change. Now, if you gained a new mind that had new thoughts and new feelings, and you practice that every day, in the beginning it's going to become, it's hard. Just like learning how to play tennis. It takes a little practice. You got to put all your attention on it. But if you keep going, it starts to become familiar, doesn't it? Now, do you know the definition of meditation? The exact Tibetan translation? The exact translation. Close. The translation means, meditation means, to become familiar with. That's it. Nothing mystical. We're going to demystify meditation. So, if you sat down and said, I want to change myself, I better become familiar with this feeling. Instead of turning on the TV, instead of getting on the computer, Latinos, instead of getting on the cell phone, set it down and say, what is this feeling? Ugh, I'm running from this feeling. I'm not going to run from it anymore. I'm going to look at it. And what are the thoughts that I think when I feel this way? How do I really think? How do I behave when this consumes me? I want to become aware of it. I want to make conscious what was once unconscious. And what are the other feelings that I work myself up into? Now, if you were able to do that and become familiar with your unconscious thoughts, your unconscious actions, your unconscious behavior, and your unconscious feelings, and you became conscious of them, would you be meditating? Come on, geniuses. Absolutely. Absolutely. Nothing mystical about that. We just went into the automatic program, we brought the material out, and we set it out, and we're looking at it. And if we can become conscious of it, guess what? Tomorrow, because we're aware, we say, anger is how I've lived my life, and if I respond now, I'm going to go unconscious, and it's going to be 8 o'clock, and I'm going to be gone. But if I restrain myself, because if I get angry, the only person I'm affecting are my own cells, not that person, but me. Guess what? I'm not going to respond. I love myself enough. This is loving to me to not do that. And you make a different choice. Would you agree that you're on a different future? And if you made that choice the next day and was able to do it day after day, would you agree that now you're on a whole new lifeline, a new timeline, a new quantum potential? This is how simple quantum physics is. You choose a change, and you maintain that change. You're going to be thinking and acting in different ways, and you're going to walk away from your genetic destiny. And you're going to keep practicing it until it becomes visceral, it becomes physiological, it becomes part of you. It is you. So then if I said to you, what is the greatest ideal of yourself? What would a great person think? How would a great person act? How would they feel? Would they be, my definition of inspiration is to move and act without consideration. When you're inspired, you're not considering obstacles. There are no obstacles. There's just life to live. And if I said to you, what's the greatest ideal of yourself? And as you began to fire and wire neurons by thinking in new ways. So if you can begin to think in new ways and become familiar with it because you're reviewing it over and over again, the repetition makes it familiar, would you agree that you're becoming familiar with a new mind? Are you meditating? Absolutely are. And if you're expressing a new ideal of yourself, would you agree that that infinite mind that's moving through you, keeping your heart beating and digesting your food, and that same infinite mind that's keeping the planets rotating around the sun, do you think it could work a new opportunity for you in your life? It already is waiting. But we have to begin to think and feel differently. That means that you got to put a new mind in your body. And you have to unlearn that old self and relearn that new self. In neuroscience, it's called pruning. Pruning away the circuits. Because nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. And the hardware of the brain changes. And if you could at the same time think and feel in new ways, would you agree that you would be forming new circuits and connections that would be called sprouting in neuroscience? So we let down the old and we create the new. And not just saying you intellectually understand it, but now you're living as if the experience is happening right now. Now that is my definition of genius. To be uncomfortable in the beginning and to be okay with it. But pursue onward until it becomes familiar and easy and second nature. The word meditation in Sanskrit means to cultivate up a new self. How, if you're a Himalayan master and you come down out of the mountains and you're enlightened, and the farmers say, how did you do that? What do you think they're going to say? You got to dig up the old self, pull out the weeds, dig up the old crops, make room for the new, and we're going to plant a new self. To cultivate self is to meditate. And there's nothing mystical about it. The Buddhists talk about it in a simple way. What is that human aspect of yourself that's driven by destructive emotions? And get familiar with who you are. And think about it a lot. Observe yourself and your actions. And we'll give you the antidote. If it's anger, we'll teach you compassion. And that's a state of mind and body. And if it's jealousy, it's loving kindness. And that state of mind. And we can unlearn the old and replace the new. And human beings have unlimited potential because we have proof in our brain and in our genes that we're much more than we think. It's that we talk ourselves out of greatness every single day. And we believe that that's true. And because we don't have any ideals in the world, we tend to fall to our lowest denominator. And we suffer quietly, thinking that there's no hope. And yet, the great people in history understood that they started out unconsciously unskilled. They didn't know that they didn't know. And then they became consciously unskilled. Like, now I know that I don't know. But as they began to learn and they began to practice, they became consciously skilled. But greatness is when we become unconsciously skilled. And when we're unconsciously skilled, then it takes no effort to demonstrate who we really are. Well, the concept of reinvention of self is a concept in neuroscience that everybody's beginning to understand as a possibility. So let's talk about this concept called mental rehearsal, and then we'll talk about how it applies to quantum physics. Okay? In other words, if we believe that our thoughts have something to do with our destiny, how does subjective mind have an effect on the objective world? How does subjective mind produce measurable, intentional, objective changes in physical reality? So, They did an experiment a little ways back where they took a group of people who pretty much never played the piano before. They divided them into 4 different categories. In the first group of people, they said, listen, we're going to teach you these one-handed finger exercises, scales and chords. We want you to come every day for 2 hours a day for 5 days. You practice these scales and chords. We're going to do a functional brain scan of your brain before. We're going to do a functional brain scan of your brain afterwards. And we're going to see if you've actually grown new circuits. Now, functional brain scans are like a motion picture of the brain. Regular CAT scans and MRIs are like a snapshot of the brain. We're looking for anatomy. We're looking for broken parts. We're looking for missing parts, injuries. But a functional scan allows us to see the brain in action, or to see the brain at work. And whenever we study the brain in action, the brain at work, that's called mind. Mind is what the brain does. So they said, okay, to the first group, come and play the scales and chords every single day. And after we do the scan, we want to see if you've grown any new circuits. So the people came and played every single day, and after 5 days, of course, they grew a whole new set of circuits on the opposite side of their brain. Well, that makes sense. If you learn something new, learning's making new connections, you get some instructions. The instruction is to apply what you've learned, to the learn how process, to get your body involved, which your mind has intellectually understood. You're going to reinforce those circuits. If you pay attention and you repeat it over and over again, you're going to absolutely grow new circuits. That's how we grow circuits. So these people grew a measurable amount of circuits in the opposite side of the brain. Second group of people, they said, come for 2 hours a day for 5 days. We'll scan your brain before, we'll scan your brain after. But listen, you come and play whatever you want. And at the end of 5 days, hardly anything happened. Why? Because they didn't get any knowledge, so they didn't make any new connections. They got no instruction. They couldn't repeat what they did the day before because they couldn't remember. And of course, they couldn't pay attention. So there was no template or no map for them to follow to reinforce circuitry. The repetition. But the template starts out with learning. Right? If you learn the scales and chords, then if you apply what you learn and you get some instruction, now that process is an experience, and the experience shapes the brain. So the third group of people, they said, don't even show up. And of course, there was no change in their brain at all. In other words, don't learn anything new, don't do anything differently, and your brain doesn't change. The last group of people, they said, come for 2 hours a day for 5 days. We'll scan your brain before, we'll scan your brain after. But listen, what we want you to do is we want you to close your eyes, and we want you to mentally rehearse playing the scales and chords. At the end of 5 days, they grew the same amount of circuits as the people who physically demonstrated the activity. Now, that was a monumental experiment because it showed that we can change our brain just by thinking differently. And not only that, when we're truly focused and we're truly paying attention, because of the size of the frontal lobe, the brain does not know the difference between what's happening out there and what's happening in here. In other words, the thought becomes the experience in and of itself when we're truly focused. Now, why is that? Well, the frontal lobe is kind of like the volume control of the brain. It makes up 40% of our entire brain, largest in human beings and any other species. And it's the seat of our free will. It's where we invent. It's when we speculate. It's when we pay attention, when we plan, when we remember, when we make decisions. It's the CEO of the brain. It's the symphony leader of the brain. But when we're learning, or when we're paying attention, or when we're planning and we're deciding, we don't want to be distracted by any other extraneous stimuli. So the frontal lobe literally lowers the volume to time and space. It literally lowers the volume to the feedback from the environment, the feedback from our body, and even our awareness of time. So when that happens, we get very present with what we're doing. And when we get present, that's the moment we make circuits, we make connections. So the people who were playing the piano were so involved with what they were thinking about, so focused on what they were doing, that the thought became the experience, and the circuitry reflected in the brain a new mind. So when we change our mind, the brain changes. When we change our brain, we change our mind. So it's a complete cycle. So how does that apply to you and I? Well, if we asked ourselves, what is the greatest expression of ourself? And we sat down and began to think independent of the environment. We closed our eyes and eliminated the stimulus that we normally perceive. The brainwave patterns would begin to slow down.
so much so that we would begin to relax the body enough so that the brain and body are no longer distracted. The moment that that happens, if we started to answer the question, what is the greatest expression of myself? What is the greatest ideal of myself? What would it be like to be happy? Who do I know in my life that's a happy person? What would I have to change about myself in order to live in joy? Who in history do I admire that I want to be like? If we had the patience to sit down and answer that question, we would begin to force the brain to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And if we can make the brain fire in different combinations or different patterns, we're making a new mind, right? We're changing mind. So we can change our brain just by thinking, but you may say, well, what is that? That doesn't really change the body. How does that change the body? Well, they did another experiment where they took a group of people and they said, look, we want you to pull a spring with your finger for an hour a day for 4 weeks. And at the end of 4 weeks, people, when they tested the muscle strength of that finger, there was a 30% increase in muscle strength. Well, that makes sense, right? You put a load on a muscle, there's resistance. You continuously stress the muscle fibers are going to break down, and it's going to grow bigger proteins so they can handle a bigger load. Normal physiology. But in another group, they said, come for an hour a day for 4 weeks, but instead of actually pulling the spring, we want you to mentally rehearse pulling the spring. And in the end of 4 weeks, they had a 22% increase in muscle strength. Now, they never touched the spring. So which means now, in the piano playing experiment, the brain and the mind were ahead of the actual experience of playing the piano. In other words, the brain looked like, if we looked at the brain after they did the rehearsal, the brain looked like they actually physically played the piano. So the brain was ahead of the actual experience. In the finger exercise, now 22% increase in muscle strength never touched the spring. That means now the brain and the mind and the body are ahead of the actual experience. So how does that happen? Again, the concept in neuroscience, nerve cells that fire together, wire together. You fire the same thoughts, think the same thoughts over and over again. The neurons continuously fire, they continuously fire. There comes a moment where the neurons release this chemical. It's like a miracle grow, it's like a fertilizer, it's like a glue that causes neurons to develop not only a long-term relationship with each other, but sprout more intricate connections. So now there's a more refined network of neurons, a greater capacity for mind, a greater intention, which sends a stronger signal down the central nervous system, and it's their mind that literally moves that spring. So then you say, well, it didn't change the body physically. There was no physical changes in the body, but the but the finger was actually stronger. So they did another experiment where they took a group of men that they asked them to come and mentally rehearse curling a dumbbell in their mind over and over again. And at the end of the experiment, these men had a 13% increase in the size of their bicep, and they never touched the weights. Now we're seeing now that through rehearsal, through the proper rehearsal, we can prepare the brain, the mind, and the body to be ahead of the actual experience. Which means then, if subjective mind is going to have an effect on the objective world, if the brain and the mind and body are reflecting the event as if the experience happened, it means in the quantum field, the experience finds us. Because the brain and body and mind are prepared for the experience. Now the problem is with most people, they're so conditioned by the environment that to think without the environment, they realize how conditioned their mind is to pay attention to the extraneous stimuli that they've been conditioned to pay attention to. So the virtual world crumbles for them, or crumbles for us, I should say, when we're distracted by stressors and events and people and things we have to do, because the stream of consciousness is interrupted with our circuitry that we've developed from our own poor neural habits. So the idea then is that how do we learn how to pay attention? How do we learn how to get present? How do we learn how to move into a state in which the internal world is actually greater than the external world. Because if we're able to do that, the willful changes that take place, because it has to take will, it doesn't work when you're watching television or you're watching a virtual show, because there's no will involved. There has to be intention. There has to be free will involved, because it's consciousness now which becomes aware of its own actions that's going to upscale the hardware of the brain. So let's talk about video gaming, because it's a phenomenon in our culture right now. So here's a kid, he's playing his video games, and every time he or she plays the video game and they blow somebody up, or break through a wall, or shoot something down, or punch somebody, or kick them, or score, or whatever they do, there's an amazing release of dopamine in their brain. And dopamine is the pleasure chemical. And if they're shooting and they're attacking, just like the army folks who are watching the virtual world and producing adrenaline, they're producing adrenaline or norepinephrine in their brain. So now you have the pleasure center being stimulated, and you have adrenaline turning on the brain for super awareness, right? Well, you play that enough times, the next time the child plays, they need a little bit more of a rush to turn on the same mechanisms. In other words, the pleasure centers in the brain recalibrate to a higher level. So now it takes more chemistry, more blowing up, more playing to produce the same physiological high. Now, that's not learning. That's associative memory. That's reacting. That's conditioning. That's impulse reaction. So now you take the kid and you bring them to school. Now learning should be a reward in and of itself. And now the child is not getting the same rush in the pleasure centers. And by the way, the pleasure centers is way higher than most kids. And they're not getting the adrenal glands turned on to cause the brain to be aware and awake. So what do? They fall asleep, or they get in trouble. And when they get in trouble, they have now a hyperactive attention deficit disorder. Well, why? Well, they're trying to produce the same chemistry so that their brain wakes up so that they can feel alive. And so the receptor sites become desensitized, and it always takes a little bit more of a rush or a little bit more chemical hit to be able to turn on those mechanisms. So what happens to the child when they're not playing video games? When they can go out and watch a sunset, or walk with their grandparent, or sit down at dinner and talk to their parents. They're aggressive, or their pleasure centers are so high that they begin to experience this thing called anhedonia, which means you can't get pleasure from anything. And so what do? When they realize that nothing in their environment turns them on, they go back to gaming, or they buy another game that's a little bit further over the top to get the same rush. And hence you see the brain chemistry changing dramatically. And the quickness in the shift in attention spans actually shortens brain activity in terms of the frontal lobe. And it creates kind of like a chronic distractibility, where they're always distracted from one event to the next because their brain has been conditioned that way. So that's not focus. That's actually reaction. And it actually messes up circuitry in the brain. Yeah, you have to be present. Time and space have to disappear. Just like, for example, as you and I are talking, there's a hum over here, but it's not important to us, so our brain lowers the volume to that. And so when we're meditating and we're truly focused or we're truly paying attention, when the frontal lobe lowers the volume to the extraneous stimuli, sensory information from the body, the motor centers in the brain shut off. In other words, there's no mind there any longer. So there's no activity there. If there's no activity, there's no mind. The parietal centers, the circuits for time and space, they shut off. So there is no time. Yeah, the lights go out. So now the only thing that's being processed is the thought. The emotional centers cool down as well. And so now the reality is the thought. And that's when the brain captures it and begins to pattern it three-dimensionally. I mean, my definition of true presence and true attention is when I forget about myself. when you're so involved with what you're doing that you want to elongate the moment, you want it to last. You're not running from it, but you're enjoying, you're expanding into the moment instead of contracting from the moment. Oh, by the way, neuroscience is actually showing right now that attention is a skill, that you can improve it. Just like golf or tennis or any other skill that you learn, that the more you pay attention and the more you practice being attentive, the more the brain will change. And the brain will begin to produce brainwave patterns that are more coherent on an electroencephalograph. That coherent frequency or that coherent pattern is when neurons love to gang up and dance to the same rhythm and make new circuits and new connections. So we can take people who have attention problems and we can train them then to begin to improve their attention so that so mind has more control over the body. Consciousness is our awareness. It's an awareness. So when we're aware and we're present with whatever thought we're embracing, the brain can record the event, the thought as an experience. And so most of the time in our waking day, our awareness is on the body, the environment, and time. Where our brains are conditioned to pay attention to the environment through our senses and to be aware of our body and how it's feeling and to be aware of time. That's a very simple survival mechanism. And it's also kind of this pain and pleasure mechanism because the thinking brain is always evaluating the environment to determine what's going to feel good based on its memory. It's going to want to move towards that and move away from what's going to be uncomfortable and what feels bad. Now that's basically how we've learned throughout our entire life. You know, when an infant is young and it cries out and it gets fed, it learns to associate crying out with being fed because that is a positive identification or association that gives rise to a habit or a behavior. Something externally from me produces some internal chemical change. And that external thing producing this internal chemical change, I'm going to notice my internal subjective chemical change and I'm going to pay attention to that so the next time I know how to get it. Move towards comfort. By the same means, if you put your finger on the hot stove as a kid or stick a fork in the light socket, in a matter of seconds you learn to associate pain with that activity. So 1 or 2 times, maybe 3, you start to pay attention with that internal chemical change called pain with that external event. And that causes us to develop negative associations or identifications that give rise to habits and behaviors. So we're conditioned in our life to move towards feeling good and move away from feeling bad. Now that's really good in terms of chemical needs and development. But when we get into bad habits, then it becomes interesting because to change is an uncomfortable process. To change is to think greater than how you feel. To think greater than your current chemical continuity, to think greater than the conditions in your environment, and to think greater than time. In other words, we have to think and act greater than what we typically do with the environment, the body, and time. It means we have to shift our attention from the constant stimulation from the body, the environment, and time, and begin to think in different ways. And so the other means of development is called creation. And when we're truly creating, there is no body, there is no thing, there is no time. In the process of creation, the brain now begins to work in different ways so that we can plan. We can devise a strategy. We can think about how we can modify our behavior. And as we begin to speculate possibilities, the brain, the frontal lobe, begins to take all of the knowledge and experience that it has, the neural networks that are reflected in terms of things we philosophically know or events we've experienced, and our wisdom as well, and begins to seamlessly piece it together to create a new idea or a new model. And now that new model becomes the plan. Now, it takes a few times to reinforce the circuitry to maintain that level of mind. Because the moment some extraneous thought takes place in our brain or some stimulus in the environment activates the familiar circuits, we forget our intentions. We forget what we were just planning on becoming. And so there's this tug of war between the old self and the new self. There's a strong pull back to the familiar self. So the importance of retreating from our world at times, retreating from our typical environment, the familiar people and the familiar job, the familiar things we do at the familiar place, no longer letting the environment to control our thinking, and we retreat from the environment. We begin to ask ourselves these frontal lobe questions. That is the reinvention process in and of itself, that as we begin to retreat from the world and we begin to separate ourselves from the typical stimuli, we're no longer acting and activating the same circuits, which gives the brain a chance to think independently of the environment. And as we said last time, that's what meditation is to become familiar with the old self, its unconscious thoughts, actions, and feelings, and become so familiar with it that we can now gain conscious control over it. And then to then reinvent a new self and be able to familiarize ourselves with that new mind and be able to reproduce that mind at will and make it look natural and easy. Now we have a new self emerging. And that new self will have a new stream of consciousness that comes with it, and a new set of chemical messengers or messages to the body that signal the body to feel in love or enlightened or inspired or generous or free or whatever we want to do. So we can create a new cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking that can become a new automatic state of being. But it's important to unlearn the old pattern. And we can't just go for the new without cultivating and pulling out the old and changing the old. So the process of meditation or the process of contemplation or the process of thinking without the environment takes focused concentration. And it also takes learning new things, because when we learn new things, the learning of that new thing creates the raw materials for us to begin to say, I got more building materials for a bigger idea of myself, a bigger dream, a bigger vision for myself or for the world. So that's why the learning keeps the brain active. It's developing new circuits. We're weighing what we know against what we don't know. We're weighing if we believe this, or we're analyzing it, or we're evaluating it, and we're finding a way to fit it into our neural structures to then build a bigger belief or a bigger perception of the way reality is. And then, of course, as we do that, we're able to then interact with in reality with more machinery to be able to see what's always existed, but we may not have ever seen it because we didn't have the circuitry in place to see it.
Creating this ego is the one that creates this separation.
The ego is when we get rooted in our ego, it means that all the automatic emotional states have been finalized, our behaviors are complete, and our thinking and our attitudes are predictable. And so when the ego is living as the ego, it's concerned about self. Its attention is on self. And because we have to survive in a culture, in a world that requires us to live in survival, the chemicals of survival drive the ego to push for what it wants, right? To push or force or gain control of, to repel, I guess. To get what we want, we have to use force to get it. Or the opposite, the ego pulls, or it attaches, or it addicts itself to it, becomes addicted to, or needs. So then holds on would be a great word to use. So that's the extremity of the reflection of the way we really are, which is both intention and surrender, thought and emotion, or activity, or focused concentration. The electrical field and the magnetic field become very polarized in the end. And so when the chemicals of stress push us into survival, we're thinking about how we can get what we want for ourselves in a certain amount of time in the environment by using our body, by using our senses, by being animal in a sense, just being overly exerting, pushing. And then by the same means, for certain people, the chemicals of stress drive them into weakness and depression and holding on and contraction, and they're attached. And so they become attached to memories and emotions. But that's the extremity, and the ego works, it holds itself in place with that very large extremity. And so as we begin to grow and change and we move more towards the midline, as we move towards the midline of the ego self, we let go of the extremity of holding on. And we let go of the extremity of pushing for what we want, or controlling for what we want, forcing what we want. And as we give up the extremity of those things, we move more towards balance. We move more towards being whole. And I guess the idea is that when fear is taken away, and aggression is taken away, and sadness is taken away, those primitive negative emotions that are run by those chemicals, we find ourselves in a state of joy. And that joy is the natural state of being. It's the presence of the moment. And so children come in with, unless they're in harsh conditions, they come in with that joy already running through them. So they're not in survival, or not concerned about that, so they can be present. And children want to elongate the moment. That's why when you say to a kid, you know, Juanito, come on inside, it's time to eat, they say, I'm not hungry. And then you say, well, it's cold out there, put your jacket on. And they say, I'm not cold. And then you say, well, it's getting late, it's time to go to bed. Well, I'm not tired. Well, come on in and take a bath, you're dirty. I don't care if I'm dirty. Now you say to an adult, come on in, it's time to eat. They say, yeah, let's eat. You say, come on in, it's time to take a bath. Okay, make sure the water's hot. So we're striving for that relief from the moment. We're striving to run away from that discomfort that is now developed within us. And so the children have that because their brainwave patterns are slower. A child that's born is functioning, for the most part, in delta waves. They're asleep with their eyes open. And they get a little older, then they move into theta. And when they're in theta, all the sensory information is going right into the subconscious brain. But in effect, it's the same thing. What external cue is producing some internal chemical change, and I'm going to associate or identify this little mechanism. And it takes no conscious control to do that. To search for pain or run away from pleasure, not a lot of conscious activity goes on with that. It's actually very primitive and very stimulus response based. And it ultimately comes to the point where you ring the bell and you salivate. It's the same thing. You see the person, you see the event, and your body immediately responds without the conscious mind. There's no conscious mind involved in that type of activity, except in the immediate moment. And the 2 or 3 stimuli in association allows the conscious brain to go to sleep, and it's the body that primarily makes those decisions. So the adult then, you know, as an adult, there are events that happen in our life that we tag emotionally important. Whether your mother tells you you're fat, or your father abuses you, or you get fired from a job for something that you didn't do, or you lose someone that you love, or your husband leaves you with children, or your wife is doing whatever it is, we tag those emotional events as important. And the memory of those emotional events actually produces the same chemistry as if the event was happening. And then that emotional state becomes who we are. Now, the more addicted we are to emotions, or the more attached we are to that emotional identity, the bigger the gap between the way we appear and who we really are. Who we really are is empty and hurting, or unhappy, or suffering. So what we do is that pain is so uncomfortable, we decide to build this identity to look smart, to be successful, to own a lot of cars, to be pretty, to do whatever we can. And we need the environment, the people in our life, the things that we do, the places we go, where we live, the times we're there. All the environmental information is important to stimulate the brain to create this facade of being a somebody, because it's too painful to be this. So we run from this feeling and we create this identity, this personality that needs the environment to remember itself. So, you know these people, you go to these places, you belong to these clubs, you do these things, you own these things, you own the boat, you own the car, and all of that you need to remember yourself as the somebody. They're strong ego markers. And so what happens is somewhere in our life, right around the 40s or the 50s, we begin to realize that we can predict the feeling that's connected to all of these things, and none of that makes us happy. So then what do people do? It's the midlife crisis, right? They go out and buy the new sports car, right? Some external thing is going to produce some internal chemical change, and I'm going to use this to make my pain or my emptiness go away. I'm aging, and I don't like myself any longer, so I'll buy the Harley Davidson. I'll buy the new boat. The affair. It could be joining the new social club, the new golf club, and meeting the new people so we feel important. To reaffirm, to try to remember this identity, because without all of this, you're left with this. And incidentally, when we die, and all of this is taken away, all the environment is taken away, we're left with this down here. We're left with that emotional feeling that somebody, and we haven't evolved in a lifetime if we've never owned that emotion. So, you could be the wealthiest man in the world, or the wealthiest woman in the world, and be the prettiest woman in the world, and have all the things you want. But if this feeling doesn't go away in your lifetime, and you don't know how to change that, then at the end of your life, you haven't evolved much at all. So, the people who realize in the midlife crisis that the environment doesn't make them feel good, and by the way, it takes enormous amounts of energy to keep this all going. I call it spinning plates. You got to spin a lot of plates to keep it all going, to run away from that feeling, right? And some people, in the middle of their life, they say, I'm not going to keep my emotional agreements any longer. I'm not going to keep my emotional connection to my husband. I'm unhappy. I'm going to just start not pretending that I'm happy any longer. I'm not going to be distracted by extraneous things so I can continuously run away from this. Some people say the game's up. I quit. And I don't want to keep it all going. And then they just stop their agreements, and they fall down to this person down here. Their family sees that. They take them to the doctor, and they give them a little Prozac, and next thing you know, they're back shaking hands and smiling and pretending like everything's okay. Now, those people who don't do that, and the novelty of the sports car wears off, or the novelty of the affair wears off, or the novelty of the new social club, or going on vacation, when all that wears off, because when they come back and it's over, they're back to that same feeling. They go to the next level. And what is that? That's video gaming. That's drugs. That's alcohol. That's gambling. That's overeating. That's shopping too much. That's pornography. Anything, we'll use anything because people don't know what else is there to make this feeling go away. And as they search for things that are addictive, like drugs produce enormous chemical changes that make the person feel great. The problem is that the next time they use the drug, they need a little bit more, because the receptor sites on the outside of the cells become desensitized. It's like living with a spouse that always yells at you. They got to yell a little bit louder to turn on your attention. Well, to turn on the cell, a little bit more chemistry the next time. So instead of gambling for $50,000, we'll gamble for $75,000. Ooh, bigger rush. Whether you win or lose, it was the rush you were looking for. But when they wake up the next morning after the drugs wear off, or the shopping is done, or the strip club, or whatever people do, the feeling's back. So then they think, how am I going to make this feeling go away? And so the external thing, with that internal chemical change, just like the baby who looks for milk, is a conditioning that goes on that allows them to become addicted. And so then this gap between the way we appear and who we really are becomes the very foundation of why people can't find happiness in their life. So this is why the law of attraction doesn't work for people, a lot of people, because they think they want to accumulate more things, right? To attract more things, and they think that'll make that feeling go away. The universal law does not work that way. The law of attraction will not work for that person until we look at that emotion, instead of turning on the TV or getting on the computer or getting on the phone or playing a video game or getting on the internet or whatever people do to distract them, to say, what is this feeling? I'm unhappy. I'm empty. I'm suffering. I'm going to look at this feeling. What are the thoughts that I think when I feel this way? What are the behaviors that I perform and demonstrate? And what are the states of mind that I live in? What is my attitude? What are the other feelings that are derived from this? And let's make conscious all of those unconscious thoughts. Now the person is in the process of change. They're pulling out from the unconscious, subconscious, and bringing it to the conscious so that they can gain more control over it. Now, as they begin to make the steps for personal change and unlearning and relearning, what I call pruning and sprouting, the death of the old self and the cultivation of the new self, whatever we want to call that, that emotional memory that they've identified themselves as a personality could have been that same emotional memory from the time they were 12 or 13 or 15. And that's when their life stopped. And that they lived by that same emotion, and that same emotion has been driving their thoughts and behaviors for the last 20 or 30 years. And now they're running away from that feeling by doing all the things, being perfect, being smart, being good, trying to be right, being successful, whatever they do to run away from that feeling. But as we begin to address the feeling and unlearn that feeling, we get closer to how we appear as who we really are. And the energy that's been holding this in place is emotion. And emotion is energy. And as we do this, and we unlearn that emotion, we're releasing that energy back into the quantum field, back into our life. And that energy now can be reorganized into a new reality, into a new life. And so the unlearning process has its effects in the quantum field as well. It's not just so that we feel better, because energy and emotion and the thoughts that are driven by those emotions are the electromagnetic field that affect every single atom in our life. The thought driven by the emotion is the electrical charge, and the emotion driven by the thought is the magnetic charge. And that field that we create holds every single atom in our life in stasis or in movement. And so if you can see, if we start owning the emotion, or freeing ourselves from the emotions, or becoming unattached to the emotion, that's energy now, and electromagnetism and thought that is now released as pure energy to be reorganized into our life. Now, if we can then take that energy and begin to think in new ways, and begin to feel in new ways, and create an elevated state of self, so we should see some measurable changes in our life. In other words, we should have feedback from our world, from our reality, that is measurable as a result of our intentions, our behaviors, and our feelings. And that should come in a way that we can't predict. It should be surprising. The greater mind should organize that event for us. All we have to do is unhook ourselves from that frozen state and begin to become neuroplastic and loose. And so we become scientists in our life then if we play this game properly. Because we can begin to track our thoughts and our emotions, our thoughts and our feelings, with the electromagnetic field that we're creating. And if we're maintaining that modified state of mind and body for our entire day, there should be something different that shows up in our world, if not that day, within a certain period of time. And we don't have to force that. All we have to do is live in joy. Because by living in joy, we already said that it's already here. We've already accepted that the outcome has happened, and that's the magnet. Joy is the magnet that draws the events to us. If we create in joy, and then we get up and live in pain, we're pushing that event away from us the whole entire time. But if we create in joy, and then we live in joy, we're drawing electromagnetically the events to us. And so, when we break through and we create transparency, which is how we appear as who we really are, and we've changed the emotional memories that we've memorized, all that energy is free energy, or raw material, to begin to create new opportunities and new experiences in our life. But it never ends. There's always more to refine. There's always more to get better at. And when we're like this, or close to this, and how we appear is who we really are, and we're happy because we've broken through the chains of our emotional addictions or our emotional habits. And we've gone on when the body has said, I'm tired, or I don't want to do this, or you can start tomorrow, or I don't feel like it. And we've persisted on and we've broken through. That's when true joy and true self-love is made manifest. And when it's made manifest in that way, and we love ourselves for what we've overcome, then we're happy without the environment. And when we're happy without the environment and we're flourishing and it's moving through us, that's when the law of attraction really works now, because we don't need the environment or things any longer to make us happy. And when we don't need them anymore, that's the moment it happens. I think there's a strong awakening that's happening, and I'm concerned, because the way the human condition usually works is that crisis usually has to be the derivative for change. There has to be breakdowns in systems before there's revolution. Because, you know, we live in the culture where comfort is so important and convenience is so necessary, and corporate choices in corporate America has pretty much lulled us to sleep. So there's a lot of changes happening globally, where people are beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, the world needs some intervention and needs some help. And you know, I always say that, you know, the three brain systems, from thinking to doing to being, are so important for all of us. You can't focus on or pray for peace, you know, because you can meditate in a city and meditate on peace, and the crime rates will lower during that time. But as soon as those people leave the community, the crime rates return back to normal levels. So it's not enough to just think. It's not enough to just have an intention. We have to actually demonstrate peace. We got to teach the body, right, to break the habit of war. If war is within us, or aggression is within us, why would we focus on peace and then go, you shake hands at church and say, peace be with you, and then you get in your car and you cut everybody off to get to wherever you need to go? That's the human condition. So we have to demonstrate it. We have to teach the body what the mind is intellectually understanding. We have to make choices, conscious choices, that transcend our typical mannerisms and our typical characteristics and temperaments. And so now, when we're demonstrating peace, or the emotional state of love, or the emotional state of freedom, and repeat it at will enough times that we can move into a state of being, now we've memorized an internal chemical state, and now we have, say, 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or 1 million people all moving through that process. Now, if they're in a state of being, they're beyond reproach. They're beyond control. No corporation is going to have them compromised, because they're in a state of being that's worked for them. No comfort, bribery of comfort is going to be of interest to them, because they've made it to a point of being. And when we're in a point of being, we've mastered it. We've mastered ourselves. And so I think humanity needs to go through the process from thinking to doing to being. And as I said in my lecture on Sunday, I don't know why, the only thing that I want material is an electric car. Well, because I have a problem with oil, and I have a problem with global warming, and I have a problem with the wars and the way things are working. But I could never stand up and fight for those things if I'm driving a gas car. But if I have solar panels and I have my electric car and it needs no gasoline at all, now I've made choices that are consistent with my thinking. Now my intention is in alignment with my behavior, or my behavior is in line with my intention, or my actions are equal to my thoughts. Now my body's getting involved. And if I'm making those choices, and I'm able to make consistent choices within that realm, I will move into a state of being that's beyond reliance. So now, if you tried to bribe the person who's done that, if you tried to manipulate them in some way, or tried to cash them out, or do something to control them, that person is in a state of being, and there's nothing that you can do that can move them from that. Imagine 3 billion people in that state of mind. What kind of world we would have. So a leader is someone who has their thoughts and their actions aligned, their mind and their body working together. A politician who has the mind saying one thing and their body doing something else. And so true leaders, whether it was Martin Luther King or William Wallace or Mother Teresa, they were leaders because they were living as if the dream was happening now. And they were uncompromising to it. And it didn't matter what was happening in their environment. the circumstances. It didn't matter if someone was threatening their life with their body. They didn't even care about their body. It didn't matter how long it took. So they were beyond survival. They were visionaries. They were creators. And so I think our goal is to begin to make choices that may be somewhat uncomfortable, that may be so inconvenient in the beginning, and to stay conscious. Because, you know, media and television and entertainment distracts us from the immediate issues. Not only on a global level, but within us as well. And as we begin to move away from the ego, being selfish, to being selfless because we've overcome the survival emotions, those negative emotions that drive us to fear and anger and hatred. Those are driven by the emotional chemicals of stress. Well, if we're able to mediate that stress response and be able to control it and reinvent a new self that's based on altruistic feelings and emotions, then the only thing we care about is contributing. Because I say, when you have everything you want in the world materially, all the wealth you want in the world, the only thing you care about now is making a difference. So if you've overcome things about yourself emotionally, then the only thing you're going to want to do is figure out how you're going to make a difference in the world, how you're going to contribute, how you're going to be selfless. And if we have enough people working on themselves within that realm to become selfless and being contributed, considering the whole, making decisions to include everybody instead of just the self, we would see pretty dramatic changes taking place in this world.